Hey, and welcome to another video from our Diversity and Inclusion Short Input series. My name is Ninakiel and I'm the Head of Diversity and Inclusion at Flying Sheep Studios in Cologne. So in case you've missed the previous talks and especially the introductory talk on why you should care about diversity and inclusion in the first place, make sure to check those out first. They are compiled in a playlist that you can just browse if you're curious. Now, today we're going to focus on neurodiversity and how you can accommodate neurodiverse employees at your company. First, let's talk about neurodiversity itself and expand on that definition that we did in one of the previous talks about terminology. So, the word neurodiversity has actually been around longer, but it was popularized by social scientist Judy Singer in 1999. Neurodiversity describes the idea that people experience and interact with the world around them in many different ways. And this framework suggests that there is no right way of thinking, learning, and behaving, and differences are not viewed as deficits. So it advocates for the acceptance of differences in human brains as natural variations instead of diseases that need to be cured. But that's not to say that the neurodiversity movement rejects medical treatment. Instead, it generally suggests to both normalize differences and also provide the support that people need to live a fulfilling life. So for example, with medication. But also by providing an environment that accommodates different ways of thinking and perceiving, for example, at the workplace. So in essence, the goal is a reframing of how we perceive neurodivergency, not as a disease, disorder, or illness, but as a normal part of nature and the human condition. Neurodiversity advocates also emphasize that these natural variations are valuable because they allow people to come at things from different perspectives, have different skill sets, and accomplish more than we could if everyone's brain worked the same way. So it's the same argument as with diversity in general. If we bring different perspectives together, there's a really good chance we'll be more successful. Now, there are two important terms that are frequently used within this neurodiversity framework that you should be familiar with. The first one is neurodivergent. This term, just as neurodiversity, was first used in the context of autism, but later expanded to other conditions like ADHD, dyslexia, dyscalculia, dysgraphia, or Tourette's syndrome, to just name a few examples. There are actually more. So this label encompasses a wide range of neurotypes. And according to studies, neurodivergent people make up 15 to 20% of the population. Neurotypical as a term is used in the neurodiversity movement as a label for everyone who fits into the norm of thinking patterns. So essentially it refers to all people who are not neurodivergent, meaning that they haven't been diagnosed with a particular condition and don't show common traits of these conditions. But the concept is flawed because there is no proper definition of what a normal or typical brain is. Brains are complex. There are some characteristics which are common among people who are non-neurodivergent, so for example the ability to make prolonged eye contact, but these are not sufficient to really clearly distinguish between neurodivergent and neurotypical individuals. And putting people in two boxes is kind of at odds with the basic idea of neurodiversity, that there is a wide range of natural variations, so rather a spectrum instead of two extremes, right? So take this with a grain of salt and remember that it's usually used by neurodivergent people to distinguish between themselves and others, and that's perfectly fine. It's just not a scientifically solid concept. Now, the good news is that we don't actually have to neatly distinguish between neurodivergent and neurotypical people in order to make the world, and especially the workplace, more accommodating for them. Because what's usually recommended nowadays is to offer options. And these are options that all employees can benefit from. So let's go through some of these. These are tried and tested ideas, but definitely not everything that you could potentially do. So expect just some suggestions, but the actual list is much more extensive, as you will see in the resources, which will be linked below. Now, the first important step, as always, is to educate yourself and reframe your perception. Because neurodivergent people are often seen in a negative light because their behaviors tend to run counter to common notions of what makes a good employee or even a decent person. So, for example, they may be perceived as rude because they speak their mind very openly, they might seem like they don't pay attention, and often don't pick up on social cues. So an autistic person, for example, might avoid direct eye contact, or someone with ADHD might constantly move around or doodle in a meeting. But that doesn't actually mean these people don't pay attention. The contrary is true. These are actually behaviors that some people show when they're focused or trying to focus. So it's important that you try to get a better understanding of the many different ways that people pick up and process information and then behave in social contexts. And being open-minded and understanding is incredibly important for neurodivergent people, because chances are that they've been criticized just for being themselves for most of their lives. And this is why many neurodivergent people practice so-called masking, which means that they try to change their behavior in order to fit in. And while that's something that most of us do to some extent, especially in professional contexts, of course, there's a big difference to essentially hiding yourself all the time. There's a great quote from Jessica McCabe, who is responsible for the YouTube series How to ADHD. She says, "While we can sometimes learn to mask those differences, they are still going to exist. Trying to pretend they don't, or being told that they shouldn't, often comes at a high cost to our sense of self and our mental and physical well-being." So masking actually takes up a lot of mental and physical resources and can have long-term negative impact on people's well-being, even leading to depression, for example. So it's very important to be as open and welcoming as possible. And that also means using clear and non-judgmental language, which I will get to in a moment. But let's first focus on the very beginning, because being more inclusive actually starts well before people start working at the company with interviews. Now, even if they are very competent in their respective area of expertise, many neurodivergent people actually don't interview that well, and that is for a number of reasons. So, for example, they may be overly honest about their weaknesses. They might not be able to make eye contact, or they suffer from anxiety in this unusual and uncomfortable setting. And we all know that and how that feels to some extent, right? But fortunately, there are a couple of things that employers can do to help people perform better. And that's starting with a set questionnaire instead of free-flowing interviews, and focusing on the area of expertise the job refers to. Now, unrelated and kind of metaphorical questions are pretty popular nowadays because they spice things up, and it's assumed that they tell employers more about the individual that is sitting right in front of them. But this is something that many neurodivergent people really struggle with. So, for example, because they don't understand why this unrelated question is asked in the first place, or perhaps because they struggle to come up with a response unprepared and on the spot. Another helpful way to accommodate neurodivergent people in these interview settings is to give them some information in advance. That means, for example, telling them who will be present in the interview and why, so their role in the company. It means giving them an idea on what the interview process will entail. So, for example, if it's just a conversation, or if they'll have to do some kind of test during the interview or afterwards. And you might even want to consider sending the applicants, all applicants, the questionnaire in advance. because no matter how much time they have to prepare, inexperienced people will still have noticeably less convincing answers. And for neurodivergent people, this would actually help offset a disadvantage that makes things so much harder for them. Now, I fully acknowledge that not all of these accommodations can be implemented at every company, but you might want to consider trying out some of these options and see if they work for you. Now, let's assume that the neurodiverse talent is hired and consider how you can help them feel more comfortable and be able to work better, because that certainly is a goal that every employer has, right? Now, the first option is remote work. And allowing employees to work remotely does definitely not only benefit neurodivergent and disabled people, but it's particularly helpful for them, because some of these people need to be in a familiar environment to feel comfortable and be productive, and others may struggle with public transport or with being on time when coming to the office. If it's not possible for you to offer remote work, or at least not for everyone and every time, there are actually some pretty easy and cost-efficient ways to make the office itself more accommodating for neurodivergent people. One thing I highly recommend is buying noise-canceling headphones, because many neurodivergent people have sensitivity to sensory input and they are easily distracted by noises around them. So offering noise-canceling headphones and allowing employees to listen to music while they're focused on work can really help make a big difference. Another common sensory input issue refers to smells. So it's important that you try not to put office rooms right next to a kitchen. It's helpful to have a dedicated lunchroom so people don't have to eat at their desks. And that's a suggestion especially for employees. Please don't be offended if a coworker who is neurodivergent or any coworker asks you to use less perfume or different aftershave on office days, because they're not judging you. They're not trying to tell you that you stink. It's just that some people are constantly distracted by intense smells. That applies to me, for example. To give you yet another example of something that is often not considered in general, fluorescent lights. Fluorescent lights can actually put a lot of strain on neurodivergent brains because they constantly flicker and make sounds. And while many people can just block out these stimuli, it's completely impossible for others. Speaking of stimuli, if you have enough office space available, it's really helpful to create a dedicated quiet room. This room should ideally be used by just one person at a time and offer the opportunity to withdraw from outside stimuli so people can get some rest and refocus. This might be especially helpful after a long meeting or several meetings when people have to process a lot of information and just can't work anymore, at least for a short amount of time. Then they can retreat to that quiet room and gather themselves again. Now, while overstimulation is very often an issue, understimulation can actually be an issue as well. And that's especially true for people with ADHD. And to help with that, you can, for example, provide so-called fidgets. You can see an example right here. These are little devices or toys that individuals can play around with to stay focused. So for example, again, during long meetings. And you could also consider allowing people to doodle, for example, or just write something down, whatever, because it has the same focusing effect on some people. Another common strategy that is used by neurodivergent people to deal with understimulation is actually movement. So this could simply mean moving around in a chair, but it could also refer to hand flapping or other movements which are likely perceived as pretty unusual. But it's important you're able to recognize this behavior as common amongst certain people and as an actual useful strategy to be more comfortable and, again, to stay focused. Another very important aspect is communication. And that's always true, of course, but there are some helpful ways to specifically accommodate neurodivergent employees. First off, it's crucial to give clear instructions and communicate expectations and outcomes. People should not be expected to pick up on subtle or hidden messages. Employees should not receive instructions when they're busy, when they're working. It's much better to wait until they have finished their task, or they should be asked directly to just briefly stop what they're doing and to really focus and listen. Feedback should be pretty direct, but non-judgmental. That's very important. It's important to not make assumptions about, for example, an employee's motivation or intentions. To give you a very specific example for that, people with ADHD in particular are often unfairly framed as lazy, but in most cases, when they're not as productive as expected, that's really just due to an unfit work environment and a lack of accommodations, including medication. Next up is work and workload management. Now, for some neurodivergent people, routines are very important, and they may also help other employees to plan their day and to be more productive. So, regular meetings, for example, should ideally always be scheduled for the same time and the same place. And if there's a change, it's a really good idea to inform employees as early as possible and provide a reason for this change. For people with conditions like working memory problems or executive dysfunction, breaking down tasks into multi-step checklists can be really helpful. So instead of telling an employee to prepare a meeting, maybe ask them to find a place and time, to invite the people who should attend, set up the agenda, prepare questions, and whatever else needs to be done. Now, again, these are just a couple of suggestions from a really, really wide range of accommodations, and there are plenty more. I also want to point out that these solutions, if you want to call them that, actually don't work for everyone, because neurodivergency and diversity includes so many different neurotypes that there cannot be a solution that could be considered one size fits all. But the more of these measures are implemented in a company, the more likely it is that the company will be able to hire and support neurodiverse talent in the long term and then benefit from this diversity. So, how can you benefit from having a neurodiverse team of employees? First, research suggests that teams with neurodivergent professionals can be up to 30% more productive than those without them. If you want to check these numbers out, they are linked in the resource section. Abilities that are particularly common among neurodiverse people can also help illuminate ideas or opportunities that teams might otherwise miss. And these abilities include visual thinking, attention to detail, pattern recognition, visual memory, and creative thinking. So fostering diversity, not just in terms of gender, race, or class, but also in terms of neurological variation, can actually be very beneficial for companies. So I hope that helps persuade them or you if you manage a company. Now, again, if you'd like to know more about neurodiversity and accommodations at the workplace, I've compiled a very comprehensive list of resources for you. So feel free to browse them and educate yourself further. Thank you so much for listening and see you next time. Bye bye.